June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord was a colossal undertaking. 150,000 Allied forces of 10 different nationalities landed on 5 beaches in Normandy, France. It was the first phase in the liberation of Western Europe. When GIs from the 1st U.S. Army landed on the beaches of Normandy, the Allies were convinced the Germans would withdraw to the Seine. The American forces would then advance quickly to Brittany, the banks of the Loire, and Paris. But they were wrong. It would take American forces nearly 2 months to travel just 50 kilometers, and their progress would be made at a tremendous cost in human life. 1 GI would die for every meter of territory gained. 40,000 men would fall in the span of just a few weeks. Though largely eclipsed by the D-Day landings and the liberation of Paris, the battle is an important case study for West Point cadets. As both a journalist and historian, I wanted to understand what happened in Normandy's bocage country in July of 1944. I conducted my investigation on the very same battlefields and heard from some of the best experts.
The man who sat in your spot couldn't get out of the cockpit in time.
I heard detailed accounts.
This is where the American tank stood.
And gathered evidence.
These buttons are from an American winter coat.
How exciting.
You don't see buttons like these anymore.
Enthusiastic reenactors helped me recreate and test out real techniques and experience real combat conditions on the ground.
If it was July of '44 right now, we'd be dead.
I helped bring the past to life and retrace the steps of Allied soldiers. In 1944, the liberation of Western Europe began during a battle that was forgotten much too soon. But GIs gave it a name: Hedgerow Hell. It seems like everything has already been said about D-Day. Still, it is hard not to feel overwhelmed by the immensity of the events. On June 6, 1944, the 1st U.S. Army had a clear primary objective. They were to establish a foothold on 2 of the 5 beaches designated by the Allied authorities. The code names were Utah and Omaha. The first wave of attack landed at the light of dawn. The Germans were ready and waiting. After the lowering of the ramps, soldiers had to cross 300 to 500 meters before they were able to seek cover from German fire. Some drowned as soon as the ramps were lowered. The objectives were achieved at Utah, but not on Omaha Beach. 4,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. The beach would be forever known to survivors as Bloody Omaha. Although the first day of the landings was deemed a success, the night of June 6th the battle was far from over. In the span of just 24 hours, nearly 60,000 men from the 1st U.S. Army had landed on the beaches. But the Allied authorities had only one objective in mind: to push back the Germans and prevent them from organizing a counterattack. Otherwise, the forces who had landed on June 6th would be driven back to the sea. They had to move further inland, and fast, to secure the area and prepare for the arrival of reinforcements and supplies. For the soldiers of the 1st U.S. Army, a race against the clock had begun. Regis Giard knows the Battle of Normandy well. The history expert often guides veterans and their families through the very areas where the battles took place.
It's always exciting to find myself at a historical site that hasn't changed all that much in 70 years. Everyone knows that June 6th was the day the 1st U.S. Army landed, but really do people know what happened after soldiers made it beyond the dunes? What were the American military authorities' objectives?
The 5th Corps that landed on Omaha Beach were to establish a beachhead as quickly as possible towards Saint-Lô in order to expand beyond the reach of German fire. For the 7th Corps, the goal was to take the port of Cherbourg, a deep-water port to supply the beachhead.
You mean to bring in supplies for the troops moving forward?
But when Cherbourg was taken, the Allies found the port had been destroyed. It was completely unusable.
What were the consequences for General Bradley's 1st Army?
Come hell or high water, the Americans had to progress inland. The Anglo-Canadian offenses were blocked around Caen. The front had to be pierced as soon as possible to the west in the American sector.
Did the Americans try to push inland?
The goal was to retrieve major roads and create corridors to head south as quickly as possible. The battle began on July 2nd, 1944 at junctions like La Haye du Puy.
After the beach invasion, a new battle began in Normandy, and that was in the town of La Haye du Puy.
That's where it all began. Let's go.
The field commander of the 1st United States Army, General Omar Bradley, had set an objective that would prove to be too optimistic. Once the Cotentin Peninsula had been liberated, he planned to establish a front across Coutances and Saint-Lô, two major junctions that would be vital to advance to Brittany, the banks of the Loire, and Paris. American soldiers were to head south, but one considerable problem stood in their way. Certain areas of the Norman landscape were located below sea level and were flooded. The Germans had destroyed the seawall as soon as the war had begun. The areas were impenetrable. German military officials only had some 70,000 troops at their command, which amounted to 6 divisions, 3 times less than the American forces. The generals of the Third Reich concentrated their forces in strategic points. Normandy was transformed into a death trap. Roads, hills, and villages were heavily fortified. Soldiers were supported by battle tanks. After the initial D-Day assault, elite infantry units arrived as backup. 2 heavily armed SS divisions were brought in, one of which was the notorious Das Reich, responsible for the massacres in Tulle and Oradour-sur-Glane. There were also Fallschirmjägers, German paratroopers whose uniforms could be identified by their distinctive insignia and design, and which have since been accurately recreated by history enthusiasts. They wore a special steel helmet, the Fallschirmhelm, and camouflage gear. Notorious among the Allied forces, who called them Green Devils, Fallschirmjägers followed the orders of their 6th commandment to the letter: never surrender. Death or victory must be the only point of honor. The commander of the 1st United States Army, General Omar Bradley, had nearly 2,200 tanks, including the M4 Sherman, to deposit infantry and provide support as troops advanced. Most important of all, Bradley had 12 infantry divisions at his command, more than 200,000 men. According to the historical reenactors who have tested them on the ground, the typical combat uniform was as austere as it was efficient. Khaki-colored pants and a button-down shirt with a green jacket, gaiters, and an M1 helmet. Soldiers could also rely on the enormous logistical support. They were never short on supplies. To progress quickly inland, GIs had more than 20,000 vehicles at their disposal, including the Jeep, which became a multi-purpose vehicle for the American Army. The famous Willys MB U.S. Army Jeep, of which 650,000 units were produced during World War II.
Régis, you couldn't have made me any happier. You called in a special taxi cab for our little trip.
Your coach awaits.
A Willys Jeep, the legendary World War II vehicle. This is a dream come true. I've never ridden in one. Was it used during the Battle of the Hedgerows?
Unfortunately, this one was strictly a liaison vehicle.
It should still fit the bill.
Shall we?
Sure. This is going to be great. As Eisenhower said when he launched Operation Overlord, let's go!
Destination, La Haye du Puy.
Here we go!
To reach Coutances in Brittany, the 1st United States Army could only take 3 routes. In the east towards Saint-Lô, in the central sector from Saint-Denis and Perrier, or in the west from Lessay, by first taking a position of vital importance, La Haye du Puy. The town itself is surrounded by 6 small mountains: Montgardon, Montcastre, Poterie, Sainte-Catherine, Mont-Étauclan, and Mont-Deauville. What American forces didn't know was that the Germans had established an ingenious line of resistance in the sector, the Malmen Line. On July 3, 1944, at the break of dawn, American forces set out for La Haye du Puy. The battlefield has hardly changed since then. It remains an entanglement of meadows, orchards, and fields bounded by a line of dense greenery, the hedgerows. Upon first impression, the landscape is a terrifying one. In a combat situation, the enemy could be hiding just about anywhere. The men of the 1st United States Army therefore found themselves in an unfamiliar environment. The Norman bocage, with its succession of fields, densely packed hedgerows that blocked the horizon, and sunken lanes were ideal for deadly ambushes. It was truly a culture shock for GIs. Regis, you told me about the Norman bocage. This is my first time seeing it. What I see is a jungle.
That's right, it's a jungle, virgin forest. That's how the Germans and the Americans described it.
For a soldier coming from Texas or Oklahoma, it must have been a new environment.
It was totally unfamiliar.
One American sergeant wrote,
"This is a war of hedgerows, a strangely limited kind of war. Fighting is from field to field and from hedgerow to hedgerow. Frequently, you don't know whether the field next to yours is occupied by friend or foe. You rarely speak of advancing a mile in a single day. You say instead, we advanced 11 fields."
Let's go!
Regis, we're talking about the United States Army here, a modern army, one that's capable of delivering incredible firepower.
But that all ended here. The Battle of Normandy would be the end of modernization. The days of air and tank support were over. You couldn't advance with Sherman tanks in these parts.
Were the sunken lanes a challenge for tanks?
Oh, they were. Aviation could barely fly over. On top of that, it was raining.
That's true, the weather was bad.
The weather was just terrible.
For all of July.
Exactly. Artillery support, which was usually done by plane, was just impossible. The U.S. Army was basically blind.
The Germans were in Cherbourg, but they were also in Normandy around La Haye du Puy.
During the Battle of Cherbourg, additional German troops were brought in to provide backup on the ground. What's more, they had become experts in defense and camouflage. Look here.
If it was July of '44 right now, we'd be dead. So there was a shift from modern warfare with plenty of resources to a war essentially fought by foot soldiers.
Classic infantry warfare, where the section leader had to advance through areas where he couldn't see a thing. He couldn't act swiftly.
So using normal military tactics was impossible.
It was.
Sticking to their usual strategy, the Americans launched a bold frontal assault on La Haye du Puy. A bad choice. The Germans used their experience on the Russian front to their advantage. They had become masters in the art of hiding in the natural surroundings. In Normandy, Germans had constructed fortifications blocking any and all passageways from the American army. Nothing was left to chance. The GIs fell right into the numerous traps that had been set.
Go!
The German defense system was an elaborate one. The first hedgerow concealed defense forces armed with rifles and automatic weapons. Heavy machine guns like the notorious MG-42 were used to attack American troops from every angle. Behind the second hedgerow stood a line of mortars that were particularly deadly, set in advance to fire projectiles high into the air. Other nearby hedges were used to hide heavy artillery, or even tanks like the Panzer IV. 9,000 units were produced. It proved to be a dangerous weapon against other armored vehicles. Snipers hidden in the trees completed the ruthless defense system. Drainage ditches were transformed into trenches unreachable by artillery and connected through a series of narrow tunnels. When forced to retreat, the Germans would hide out in the next field over, which would then be defended in the very same way. It only took a few men to face down an entire battalion. American military officials had been counting on aerial support to bomb the German positions, but there was just one problem, and it was considerable. The weather was dismal during the summer of 1944. Planes were unable to take off. Even small aircrafts intended for spotting duties, like the Piper Cub, were stuck on the ground. Those that did make it into the air were often brought down by enemy fire. Field artillery units were essentially blind, and in such conditions, they could not effectively assist advancing troops on the ground. Therefore, American strategists had no choice but to rely upon armored vehicles to crush enemy defenses. Notably, one tank in particular, of which 50,000 units were mass-produced, the M4 Sherman, the Allied forces' secret weapon. But the Germans had thought of everything. Around La Haye-du-Puy, entire fields were turned into death traps, like Montgardon, which was nicknamed Bloody Hill.
Regis, was Montgardon really the heart of the battle?
Here we're in Montgardon, at the top of the hill and on the main line of defense. I'll show you a field where a German resistance system, fortification specifically, was constructed.
Is that the landowner?
The landowner, Joel. He works the field.
Hi, Joel. I'm Serge.
Hello.
Hi, Joel.
Regis was telling me that this was the heart of the battle that took place all around La Haye-du-Puy. He said the fields were fortified, but I just see a field. I don't see any fortifications. Do you know where their fortification system was?
Yes, I do.
Could you show us?
Sure.
All right, let's go. What's rather incredible is that you can see the hedgerow, but you can't make out the line of defense. Is that it over there?
Part of it. The area must have been used as an ammunition depot.
I see. And what's that? That looks like the roof of a bunker.
That's the roof of a small shelter.
I see. Is it still accessible?
You can go inside.
Do you have a flashlight, Regis? Great. This is so neat. Have you seen many like this one?
No, I haven't. You usually see just small shelters made out of stacked wooden railroad ties.
This one's made of concrete.
It's pretty rare to find concrete on defense lines in this sector.
I'm going in. Impressive, isn't it? It's still here 70 years later. There are the air vents.
There are more on the other side.
Yep, there's another one there.
Exactly.
Scraps of steel are everywhere. Here's a German cartridge.
That's from an M98.
There's a little bit of everything. Shall we head back out?
Let's go.
Your field is full of holes, like a block of Swiss cheese.
I suppose it did look like Swiss cheese in '44.
Was there some sort of trench here?
There must have been a trench running all along here because screw pickets are often found around here,
I see.
as well as thick barbed wire.
Does it continue over there?
The trench runs all along the bank.
Is there another blockhouse system over there?
There used to be a bunker for a cannon.
Okay. So that was an artillery zone, like Joel was saying, and there was a shelter here. Was the other corner protected?
Yes, it was. That's why this field in Montgardon is so special. It was a Panzer IV, a German tank that used the sunken trough as protection.
Did you know about the Panzer, Joel?
Yes, I did.
Could you show us where it was?
I sure can.
This is incredible, Regis. It sounds like the Germans literally blended into the landscape.
That was the whole idea of their defense system. They relied on natural lines and banked hedgerows, and they equipped certain corners of the field with Panzer IVs. The tank came in through the field's entrance, which used to be here. The water hole was there. It drove right into it.
That's where it was camouflaged.
Yep.
Okay.
It could then fire in this direction along the ridge. There was a Sherman over there, and it was taken right out.
This is where the American tank stood, right in this very spot. You see the grass remained yellow. The grass next to it is a little greener. If we weren't in the middle of a drought, it would be much greener and that grass would still be yellow.
In fact, it never grew back.
Nothing has grown here for 70 years.
Is that because the soil is sterile, or is there something in it?
It just takes a bit of digging to find some melted scrap metal.
Really?
Yeah?
Right here. You just have to dig.
Yeah, let's do that.
Indeed, there are some pieces of steel. That's part of a Sherman tank.
That's incredible.
Look at that.
More shards.
Is there more metal than dirt in your land, or what?
Just about.
So in fact, the Sherman came in through this field, and the Germans were so well hidden, especially the Panzer over there, that the tank's crew didn't even stand a chance.
That's right, not a chance.
It was right there, and it stayed there.
And it left a mark on the ground that's still visible 70 years later.
The Montgardon tragedy was not an isolated event. In Normandy, Allied forces lost hundreds of tanks and their crews. The numbers were staggering. It took as many as 5 Shermans to defeat a single German tank. But how could a mass of steel weighing over 32 tons be so vulnerable? I had to learn more about one of the emblematic tanks of World War II, the M4 Sherman. As a member of the association The Wheels of Liberation, in which he plays an American foot soldier, Joris Farreau is also wild about tanks. He studies them, takes them apart, and has even learned how to operate them. He knows all there is to know about the Sherman. We've barely been here for 5 minutes and I'm soaking in sweat. What about you?
That's right. Here we're just behind the motor, which is blowing all of its heat towards us. All the hatches are already open for ventilation.
It must have been hell when they were closed.
It was. The main gun gave off even more heat. When the spent shell casings were ejected, they filled the area with corrosive fumes. It was almost like tear gas for the crew.
Was the Sherman a good or a bad tank in the end?
Well, the tank was mass-produced, meaning that the Americans had opted for quantity rather than quality.
Did they produce tons of tanks to send them to the front?
That's right. They made a standard model, which was average overall, but which could be used in most situations.
What was the Sherman's weakness in the bocage? I just came from Montgardon, where I saw that some tanks had burst into flames like boxes of matches.
I'll bet there was a hedgerow nearby.
A hedgerow wasn't far.
That was a problem the Americans encountered in the Norman landscape. They had to pass through these dense hedgerows.
They were practically hard as rock.
The tank was the only vehicle capable of making an opening. When a tank tried to drive over a hedgerow, the bottom would be exposed. And the bottom happened to be the most vulnerable spot. German paratroopers would hide just a few meters behind the hedges and fire rocket launchers aimed just below the tank. They were sure to destroy it completely.
Edwin Schmiege, a young Fallschirmjäger from the 3rd Paratrooper Division, described the experience.
As soon as we heard the sound of an engine or the clinking of tank tracks, we would leave our hideouts and move in to destroy it. It was so easy that in the naivete of our youth, we would argue about whose turn it was to fire.
But the tank was heavily armored. How is it possible that it would burst into flames and leave behind traces that are still visible today, 70 years later?
Because the back of the tank was loaded with hundreds of liters of fuel. There was oil in the engine, hydraulic oil was used to maneuver the turret, and there was all the stocked ammunition. When a projectile was able to pierce through, the heat caused the whole thing to burst into flames. They say the crew of a Sherman had less than 10 seconds to evacuate.
But 10 seconds, that's basically nothing. Did no one escape?
Especially the man who sat in your spot, the loader. As you can see, there was only one hatch for 3 people in the turret basket. The loader generally couldn't make it out of the cockpit in time.
Did the Germans have a field day firing on Sherman tanks?
Yes, they sure did. The Germans nicknamed the tanks Tommy cookers.
Like the portable stoves?
Yes, because the crew would sometimes be burned alive inside their tank.
To destroy the American Sherman tanks, the Germans had 2 dangerously effective weapons at their disposal. The Panzerfaust, the armor fist, which launched a hollow charged grenade that could pierce through armor 200 millimeters thick from a distance of 60 meters, and the Panzerschreck, the tank's fright. My many years spent studying history hadn't prepared me for this. Firing at a tank is a daunting task, like having to take out an elephant with a slingshot. Hey guys, shouldn't you start firing? In Normandy, the orders given to German soldiers were clear. They were instructed to avoid wasting ammunition. Therefore, they only fired if they were sure to hit their target. Their anti-tank weapons were to be used at very close range.
Fire!
La Haye-du-Puy was liberated on July 9, 1944. The town had been almost entirely demolished. 3,000 American soldiers lost their lives in the taking of Montgardon. Of the 127 paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division, only 12 survived. In total, American forces lost 10,000 men to gain just 10 kilometers. General Bradley had no reason for celebration. The offensive launched in early July was to reach Coutances in Brittany by 3 routes. East toward Saint-Lô, in the central sector toward the towns of Saint-Denis and Perrier, and west from Lessay via La Haye-du-Puy. The American offensive had been successful in breaking through the barrier of La Haye-du-Puy, but Coutances was still another 20 kilometers away. Worse still, the Germans had had enough time to hide out behind other defense lines. GIs would once again have to overcome the Hedgerows, which they cursed day and night as their tanks struggled to advance.
Are we in the typical bocage setting?
Yes, we are. The typical setting has hedgerows that go back many millennia.
Are they really that old?
They are. In 1944, they were at least several hundred years old.
I see. You can really tell they're very dense. The roots make the banks as hard as rock.
They haven't changed. They were already like that back then.
Did the Normans use them for firewood?
They were essentially used to protect crops as well as for firewood.
That looks absolutely impenetrable.
Crossing a hedgerow was an adventure in and of itself.
I'm tempted to experience it myself. I love it when history comes alive. I'm going to try to cross.
Go for it. I'll wait for you on the other side.
Okay, sounds good. Oh, wow, this is so dense. I'm getting scratched up. I don't know how long this will take. Impossible, huh? I think I've successfully found my way out, Regis.
Sure, but I think you're dead.
Don't tell me that the American military officials hadn't prepared for this kind of terrain.
But that's what happened. Given the colossal means deployed on D-Day, the Allied forces thought the Germans would then withdraw to the Seine. But Hitler had given the order to defend every last inch of terrain.
To the very end.
The very end.
But what happened? Did the hedges keep the Americans from advancing?
Hard battles were fought, and combat lasted days at a time. 3,000 men were lost per infantry division.
But in the central sector, was there also an offensive attack between Carentan and Saint-Lô?
The offensives began simultaneously.
Did they both go the same way?
Let me show you something.
Another offensive was launched in the central sector at the same time as the one in La Haye-du-Puy. The primary objective was to take the route connecting Perrier to Saint-Lô. From Carentan, 2 American divisions were to take hold of Perrier by way of a narrow strip of land wedged between 2 marshes. One obstacle stood in the way, the town of Saint-Denis. Further east, American forces crossed the Vire-Tot Canal and headed south. To better understand the landscape where the offensive was launched, I had to take to the skies.
Awesome. I feel like I'm on that 1970s show, Baba Black Sheep, but that sure isn't Pappy Boyington.
No, it isn't. This is Patrick Néron, the director of the Normandy Tank Museum.
Hello.
It's a real pleasure to meet you, Patrick.
Hello, how are you?
So you'll be my pilot. That isn't a Corsair.
No, it isn't. This is a Piper Cub, an observation aircraft used by American forces. I think you'll understand why things didn't go as planned around Saint-Lô and Saint-Denis.
Well, this may be a small plane, but I would just love to see what you can do.
That'll be no problem.
Let's get going.
Let's go.
Will it be a bumpy ride?
No, the weather's calm today.
Enjoy the flight.
Thanks, Regis.
American forces built several airfields in Normandy for fighter aircrafts. Other smaller airfields were reserved for observation planes like this Piper Cub, which had short takeoff and landing capabilities of just 100 meters or less. The goal was to establish closer relations with combat units and to inform them as much as possible, thus shedding some light on the dark events surrounding the War of the Hedgerows. Aerial observation of the battlefield is much better than mere words. It's impossible to ignore the craters made by the bombings, now permanent scars in the landscape. And soon enough, I noticed one key detail. In the central sector, like all around La Haye-du-Puy, the huge grid of hedgerows is most striking of all. Around Saint-Denis as well, GIs could only see a few meters into the distance. How could the American forces find their way through such a labyrinth? I had to put myself in the middle of the battlefield, amid the hedgerows, to find my answer. Kevin Lemonie is not just a living history enthusiast. The former non-commissioned officer for the French Army has immersed himself in the combat techniques used by the American infantry.
I want to understand, Kevin, without artillery and aerial support due to the terrible weather conditions, how could a U.S. infantry squad progress through the Norman landscape? Take this spot, for instance. We would have been faced with Germans holding the hedgerow. How could your soldiers have moved forward?
The section leader would simply have to fire his .30 caliber machine gun out across the landscape before allowing his soldiers to move forward. Then he would set up a 60mm mortar to wound a maximum number of soldiers in enemy zones.
Would the Germans stay covered while the squad moved forward?
That's correct. So, once the mortar had been positioned, riflemen and scouts were sent out on the ground in order to spot the enemy.
Did they follow the edges of the fields?
Yes, that's right. They followed the terrain. The terrain dictated their next move. They would follow the edge down and over through the rugged terrain, a stream or a bank. They would move in on the enemy as close as possible to gain information, to know their position, their numbers, their ammunition, and then that information would be relayed to the section leader, who would then determine the next tactical move.
I see. That sounds like a pretty basic war strategy. It almost sounds like a game of hide and seek.
It was. They advanced patch of land by patch of land from one hedgerow to another.
Progress was determined in terms of hedgerows rather than kilometers.
Unfortunately so.
The Norman landscape allowed no room for bayonet attacks or tank charges. In reality, the GIs could only rely on themselves. In such conditions, coordination between tanks and infantry proved challenging, if not impossible. When they could, advancing troops remained as close to Sherman tanks as possible. They would tap the butt of their rifles on the tanks to indicate the enemy's location. For the tanks that risked crossing the fields without backup, they became easy targets, sliding on the muddy terrain. The number of casualties was staggering. The American offensive launched on July 4th in the central sector struggled to reach its objective. The strategic point of Saint-Denis fell on July 10th. On July 14th, the villages of Tribou and Auxey were liberated. But the following week, the Americans were still stuck in Marchessieu. American forces also moved to Le Désert and Les Champs de l'Osque and Pont-Hébert. But GIs were held back for 5 days by members of the 2nd and 17th SS divisions, who were eventually joined by a German armored division known as Panzerlehr. The Germans even went as far as to launch a counterattack. The challenge of advancing through the unfamiliar terrain did not explain the First U.S. Army struggle in the central sector. In fact, the Americans had missed their chance to pierce the German front. They managed to break the enemy line, but military officials made one mistake. They immediately sent 100 tanks from the U.S. Armored Division through the corridor. The tanks jammed small roads and brought all progression to a halt. Any hope of progressing beyond the route that connected Perrier to Saint-Lô was lost. After 2 weeks of bitter combat, American forces had only gained a few kilometers. Since early July, 400 GIs had been losing their lives every day in the Norman countryside. Both camps were exhausted. Ernie Pyle, one of the most popular American war correspondents at the time, wrote,
"The soldiers around us had 2 weeks' growth of beard. Their uniforms were worn slick and very dirty. The uncomfortable gas-impregnated clothes they had come ashore in. The boys were tired. They had been fighting and moving constantly forward on foot for nearly 3 weeks without rest, sleeping out on the ground, wet most of the time, always tense, eating cold rations, seeing their friends die."
How could the reenactors' passion for such horrific and painful events be explained? Kevin, I was watching you this afternoon on the ground. I'm fascinated by what you do. I'm like a kid. What motivates you to do what you do?
We aren't just pretending to recreate a war. We're basically paying tribute to all the young soldiers who lost their lives on French soil, although they came from many different backgrounds. That's why I do it. It's about paying tribute to them through scenes that are recreated down to the very last detail, like your canteen cup from 1918.
It's a thrill to be drinking out of this.
It sure is.
Is being as historically accurate as possible one of your biggest concerns?
It is. Even the tiniest details are very important. We use photographs and videos to recreate combat teams with the right equipment for the right period and for the right unit.
In regards to living conditions, does the fact that you sleep outside on the ground help you better understand first-hand written accounts?
Yes, it does. First-hand accounts are very important. They also show us what the life of a soldier was like beyond the front line, the feelings he experienced, the stress of not knowing if he would survive another day, what he would eat that evening, where he would sleep. We are fortunate enough to sleep under a tent. Often the opposite was true for soldiers, who would sleep in a foxhole just a hole in the ground. They had to spend the whole night under the stars or in the rain.
The pouring rain?
Yeah.
Those conditions must have been particularly hard.
As was the fear of the day to come.
I think I'll stick close to you tonight.
Our foxhole is ready and waiting.
In any case, thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I've only spent a day running from one point to another, and despite the fatigue, I imagine that it's nothing compared to what soldiers felt in 1944. The day's events raced through my mind. American soldiers must have felt pretty far from home, even if from time to time, special service units would drive by in a vehicle equipped with speakers that were hooked up to a good old record player. Despite brief moments of relief, I can guarantee that those GIs slept poorly, if at all, near the hedgerows.
Good morning, Serge.
How are you?
Good, and you?
I'm all right.
How'd you
I
sleep?
slept fine.
Not too cold?
I've had better nights. Fascinated by the Second World War, Philippe Charbonnier specializes in the United States Army.
Hi, Serge.
Hi, Philippe. How are you?
Good. Did you get any sleep?
Well, the foxhole sure wasn't an easy experience.
No kidding.
It was just one night. I knew I'd be tired, but I can't even begin to imagine how American soldiers made it through one night after another in such conditions.
Yes, and the nights were so short.
Followed by periods of combat.
They had so much to do. At night, the Germans never left them alone. It was a challenge getting any sleep at all. They were so exhausted that even restful sleep didn't help much.
What were the primary concerns of the soldiers who found themselves somewhat isolated in the Norman bocage, at the foot of the hedges?
Well, this terrain is rather unusual. There was a tendency among American soldiers to feel trapped because they weren't used to this environment. Normally, they had to dig a hole to protect themselves from aerial observation, and from enemy artillery units in particular. They had to find a position to defend themselves.
Sounds like shovels were almost just as important as firearms.
Absolutely. American soldiers were used to paring down. They were used to traveling light. But they always had a gun and their entrenching tool, both of which were essential for their survival.
Combat conditions were really tough. I've heard of battle fatigue, which is a precursor to post-traumatic stress disorder.
Physical and emotional exhaustion would set in after about 10 days, if the soldier had been lucky enough to survive. Then he might be knocked out by psychological exhaustion.
Were American troops well equipped compared to their enemies? We know the Germans were well camouflaged. They already knew the terrain. They had already been here for a few years.
It depends in what area. It's true that considerable logistic planning was involved, and in certain areas the Americans were technically superior. They had already been at war for 3 years, and a huge chunk of the defense budget went into research. So in terms of transmission and artillery, for example, the Americans had a crushing advantage at the level of infantry combat.
My enlightening experience in the Battle of the Hedgerows must come to an end. I have to head over to Saint-Lô.
The ruins capital.
Yes, that's right. Could you show me the way?
No problem.
I'm afraid I'm lost in the Norman countryside.
I'll put you in touch with my friend Yannick. He knows the battlefield well. He'll have plenty of stories to tell.
Great. Blocked outside of Série after having taken La Haye-du-Puy and stuck in the central sector, the Americans had only one remaining objective, and that was to capture Saint-Lô. On July 11, 1944, General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st U.S. Army, launched the offensive. But how could they seize a town that had been resisting attacks for more than a month? Walking around Saint-Lô and the surrounding areas, it became clear the GIs were confronted with more hedgerows and sunken lanes. But American troops were sick of losing tanks and their fellow comrades whenever they tried to cross such obstacles. They had been searching for solutions since late June. On July 19th, Lieutenant Colonel Disney of the 2nd Armored Division sent a classified report to General Headquarters. In just 2 pages and 2 sketches, he explained how tank dozers, or tanks equipped with a bulldozer blade, should go about tackling the various types of hedges. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough of the earth-moving machinery to do the job. The American soldiers had done the math. Advancing 1.5 kilometers of terrain would involve crossing 34 hedgerows. Initiatives to reinforce the tanks were multiplied, but one tank operator from the 2nd Armored Division of the United States Army was about to go down in history. His idea was so brilliant that in January of 1961, General Eisenhower, then President of the United States, would pay him a glowing tribute.
There was a little sergeant. His name was Cullen, and he had an idea. And his idea was that we could fasten knives, great big steel knives, in front of these tanks. And as they came along, they would cut off these banks right at the ground level. They would go right through. And then they would carry with themselves a little bit of camouflage for a while. But then someone did have a big question. Where are you going to get the steel for all this thing? Well, now happily, the Germans tried to keep us from going on the beaches with great steel chevaux de frise, big crosses. They were all big bars of steel down on the beach where the Germans left it. And he got it. Got these things sharpened up, and it worked fine. The biggest and happiest group, I suppose, in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew that this thing worked. And it worked beautifully.
In mid-July of 1944, General Bradley approved the plan and requested a maximum number of tanks be modified. By late July, 3 and 5 tanks had been fitted with hedge cutters. American soldiers nicknamed the modified armored vehicles rhino tanks because the hedgerow cutting devices resembled tusks.
You can really see the hole where the hedge, which is usually impenetrable, was completely dozed over.
Yes, you can still see the traces from here. And as you can see, the bank isn't too high at first. You can make out where the tank demolished it.
Was this an actual combat zone?
We are currently on the front line of a combat zone. The tanks were trying to pass through. The Germans had either already been killed or continued to fight and tried to protect themselves. They also could have been waiting for the tank to pass in order to take it out from behind. The Americans usually came through with infantry following the tanks. And on each side of the bank, you can still find objects left over from combat. There are American cartridges on the one end.
It must be a real treat for you.
Oh, yes, yes.
Can you find stuff lying around in a field like this?
Just take a walk through some tilled fields. In general, any areas that were in combat zones left a lot of debris behind.
Sounds fun. Let's do some exploring.
Shall we make it a competition?
Whoever finds the most wins. Sound good?
Sure.
Yannick, I think I found some buttons.
Look, there's another one.
That's right. This is really something.
Incredible. You don't see buttons like these anymore. These buttons belong to a pea coat, those big, heavy American-style winter coats.
You can still make out the American eagle.
Yep.
And here's a cartridge. This is a real treasure hunt. The button is somehow more interesting than the cartridge.
Of course, because there are cartridges everywhere. You really don't find buttons like these anymore, or so many.
That must mean a coat was left behind.
Yeah, that sure is a nice little discovery.
There's a small one over there.
You're finding everything.
Yep, today's my lucky day.
Beginner's luck.
That must be it. I don't come to Normandy that often. Do you occasionally find larger items?
Yeah, we've been known to find helmets at field entrances.
Is that what you wanted to show me? Well, let's go check those items out. I'll go first to pave the way. I'm starting to get used to this prickly Norman bramble.
Don't forget, I'm the one in the shorts.
Yeah, exactly. So is everything but the cardboard box authentic?
No, even the cardboard is authentic. This box was made in March of 1943.
This isn't just some hobby or a personal collection. This is an obsession.
Sometimes objects speak louder than photographs.
So what do you have here?
I've collected a few items that are very representative of the Battle of the Hedgerows. This one is an odd little item. This is all that remains of a cup from an American canteen.
That looks just like a piece of tin metal.
Exactly, I scratched a bit.
Actually, the bottom of the cup.
There's the name of a soldier, his service number, and his home state. His name was Francis B. Cox.
B. Cox from West Virginia, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. He was a soldier who belonged to Company B of the 175th Regiment. He was wounded on Hill 108 near Villiers-Fossard and would be wounded once again in Brest.
Is he the one who engraved that?
He did more than 70 years ago. In the same vein, this is another American helmet.
From the blue and gray, in fact.
The special designation for the 29th Division, and which notably bears, it received a hit on the side. Upon inspecting it, I found the name of a soldier. His name was Sergeant Tignères. He was from the same company as the soldier who had the canteen. Sergeant Tignères had been wounded, returned to combat, and was later killed in Germany in November of 1944. He was buried in a Dutch cemetery. This is a cap that was worn under a helmet. It was found in a pile of 75mm cartridges.
There's also an insignia.
There's a small insignia on the side from the 3rd U.S. Armored Division. It also bears the name of a soldier, Anthony Paricki. Further research helped me determine that Anthony Paricki was killed on June 29th, a date that corresponds with the first day of the attack mounted against the 3rd Armored Division.
It must be very exciting to find this out in the field.
The excitement of finding something like this is one thing. The research that follows to identify the soldier is another. You know, that's the icing on the cake. What's more, I found a photograph of soldier Anthony Paricki. So there you go, we put a face to the name.
On July 18th, the 29th Infantry Division was headed for Saint-Lô. You've also retraced their tracks through old films and photographs.
I'm just as fascinated by photographs and documents that pertain to this particular battle. I researched these photographs in an attempt to identify certain locations and the historical context and, if possible, find where they were taken.
Can you walk me through what happened in Saint-Lô on July 18th, 1944 with the 29th Division?
I can do that.
All right, let's do it. We can, and we will.
Okay, let's go. Yeah?
And with such an expert as yourself, let's go. Let's go to Saint-Lô. After 6 days of slow progress, on July 18, 1944, a task force was formed and led by Brigadier General Cota. Its mission was to enter the town from the northeast. An infantry battalion of nearly 1,000 soldiers arrived ahead of the intervention force. It was led by Major Johns. He and his men were the first to enter Saint-Lô. But the operation would not be easy. The Germans had camouflaged artillery batteries in the town's southern suburbs. Their cannons destroyed major roads, intersections, and streets. One piece of artillery had a particularly devastating impact: the 88 anti-tank artillery gun. Its firepower was so dangerous that Allied soldiers, particularly tank operators, came to dread it. "70 years after the military operation, dirt roads have been replaced with paved streets, but the route still follows the same winding curves." Were operators with the American Army aware of the historical significance of the event they were covering? Possibly. They filmed every second of the struggling procession. The 2 final kilometers were captured on film. Enemy cannons thundered in the distance. Exploding shards of steel whistled in the air. With our Jeep, Yannick and I take a trip through time. We pass walls, trees, and houses. The landscape is the same, but we drive faster than the Allies probably did. Safer, without a doubt. It feels like a tank might appear, or that the shadow of a helmeted American soldier might pop out from a nearby ditch. GIs had waited a month and a half to see the sign announcing they were entering the town limits.
Saint-Lô, a town that should have been taken just after the landing. A town the Germans were not going to give up without one last fight. Are we coming up on the Bascule intersection?
We're arriving at the intersection. The cemetery's on the left.
So this is the Bascule intersection.
Yes, 100 meters ahead. The Coda task force arrived by way of this route. The tanks then spread out throughout the town to defeat the Germans who were still here. Major John set up his command post at this very intersection.
Right there?
Yes, right in that spot. The Germans weren't yet aware that the Americans had arrived. Major John saw that an 88 cannon was firing on the American lines in the distance. He gave the order to destroy the cannon, but they missed. The Germans realized that someone...
Did they realize the Americans were there?
Someone was firing at them, and they saw it was coming from the intersection, so they began firing.
It must have started raining bombs.
From that moment, it became one of the most dangerous parts of Saint-Lô. The Germans had a clear view of the intersection, and they began hammering at it and destroying buildings. The Coda task force arrived at the end of the day on July 18th. On July 19th, Major John's command post had become unsustainable. He told his men to find another place where he could set up headquarters.
Where was that command post set up?
Nearby, it was moved to the Saint-Lô cemetery.
The cemetery?
They famously set up headquarters in the Blanchet mausoleum, famous because...
Are you saying that they moved into a burial vault?
The Blanchet family burial vault.
Specifically that one over there?
The one at the entrance.
I see.
Major Johns left us a very interesting account of the events. The following passage describes his experience of the Blanchet tomb and what he saw upon his arrival here. 30 minutes later, Menzer arrived to take him to his new home in Saint-Lô, an imposing mausoleum in the cemetery. The facade was engraved with two words that Johns would never forget, Famille Blanchet. Beneath the chapel was a crypt that could be reached by a very narrow set of stairs, accessible on one side. The vault was almost entirely occupied by an enormous stone sarcophagus. It had been built in such a way that it slanted toward the entrance. Its back end presented a flat surface that was somewhat impractical due to its height, but which could be used for reading maps. It was better than nothing at all. The Germans had already used the crypt. Empty wine bottles were scattered across the floor, and a piece of hard stale bread had been left on the stone table. Johns ordered for the area to be cleaned. The crypt was tiny, but it would still do.
The fall of Saint-Lô on July 18, 1944, marked the end of the Battle of the Hedgerows, but the GIs were not done yet. They continued on to Brest and its surrounding bocage landscape. Although official reports spoke of victory in Normandy, in reality the objectives were far from achieved. 4,500 American soldiers from the 29th and 35th Infantry Divisions had been killed or wounded in the liberation of Saint-Lô. 400 of the town's 12,000 residents had also lost their lives. The town was entirely demolished. It became known as the capital of the ruins. From early July, 40,000 GIs lost their lives in the Norman bocage. Frustrated by the war's static battles, military officials determined a change of strategy was necessary. They launched Operation Cobra, a massive bombardment that would create a corridor a few kilometers wide through which American forces could pour. At 9:40 a.m. on July 25th, 2,500 B-17 and B-24 bombers began releasing 4,000 tons of explosives over an area of 12 square kilometers, just south of the major road joining Saint-Lô and Perrier. An entire division of German armored vehicles was pulverized. 45-ton tanks were demolished in the blast of the explosion. American troops set forth through the corridor in the direction of Coutances and Brittany. But the liberation of France and Western Europe was not yet within reach. Many more battles would still have to be won.